Hello everybody, welcome back to Happy Little Diodes. Today we've got another 48K in for repair, but this one is a proper one. It's a real customer's speccey that they love and cherish and have owned since they bought it in the 80s. These are always the best things to work on. I love seeing them up and running and everyone's always happy when they get them back. So let's crack on, get it out of the box and see what we've got. The faceplate's hanging on by the skin of its teeth. Actually it's just come off. The glue's all old and tired, and I can see why. When I pull this rubber key mat off, the customer's already put a new membrane in, so that's pretty handy for me. I will tidy up that glue and reapply the faceplate neatly. Alright, here's the exciting bit. What are we going to be faced with? It looks like an issue 2. Yeah, it sure is. The heatsink's in the bottom right. It's got the variable resistor pots and it has a 5C112E ULA, which is the one that came with the issue 2. The lid of the RF modulator is on upside down. That's because somebody's been in there and done a composite mod. They've actually done it without solder. I've seen guides for this. You can achieve it by twizzling wires. Obviously it's not very robust, I don't really like it, so we'll rip that off and we'll do a neat job with a capacitor. And off it comes. We'll take the lid off and have a look inside. I expect it's just twizzled around the jack of the video output. Yeah, there it is. That will probably just pull out as well if I apply some force. There we go. At least it's easy to clean up. Unfortunately the two wires here have been cut, so it would be difficult to revert the machine back to its original RF output, but that's okay. I imagine this is going to stay as a composite output machine from now on. Alright, let's free it from this case and have a closer look. It looks like it's had some rework done at some point. I can see flux around the pots and around the sockets, the mic sockets and the DC socket at the top. That's okay though, nothing for us to worry about. It looks like a proper job was done. So let's make a composite mod on it first, because I don't want to leave it half done. Then we can start to diagnose any faults. I'll start by removing this wire which was cut and clearing the joint so I can get a capacitor in there. There's our 100 microfarad 16 volt capacitor with a fairly short package so it will fit neatly. Did see one of these done recently. The capacitor was entirely within the modulator casing and it looked quite neat. Wondering if that's a way to go from now on. What do you think? That's one leg soldered to the socket. Make sure when you feed the leg into the casing that you go over the top of the tab on the socket rather than through the hole that's in that tab, because otherwise you can impede the jack from coming in. And the other leg soldered to the board. We can pop this lid on the correct way up. Alright, with that all tidied up, I want to check the resistances for each of the voltage supplies to our lower RAM chips. That's the -5, +5 and +12 volt supplies. If any of these are too low, then we know that there's a short somewhere. It could be in a transistor, could be in a chip. Fortunately ours are looking good, which means I'm happy to apply power to the board with a current limiting power supply. This allows us to check for our voltages, so let's have a look, see what we get. First of all, you need to plug it in, otherwise you'll get 0 volts on everything. Little tip there. Let's try that again. That's our -5 or -4.7, close enough. Here we should find +12, looking good, and +5, also looking good. Nice, so let's have a look at what's happening when we plug it into the telly. It seems to work. Oh well, that was an easy repair job. I'll send it back, thank you very much. Nah, I'm just kidding. The owner had already told me that it boots up, and he actually also sent me this picture from a diagnostic cart that he'd ran, and it shows that chips 21 and 22, which are two upper RAM chips, have failed. This kind of helps us. It means it's a fairly easy repair job. but I want to take the opportunity to do a bit of upper RAM diagnostics with you, a little bit of fault finding. Since you're watching this, you're probably already familiar with this command. It's a classic print peak 23732 plus 256 times peak 23733. I know, it just rolls off the tongue. This basically tells us how much usable memory there is in the machine. So on this machine we get 32K. We know the first 16K is the ROM, so that means we have a 16K specky. The upper RAM is not working. If we had working upper RAM, we would see 48K of RAM usable, plus the ROM gives us 64K, would be the result. Now any reasonable person would take this at face value and crack on with the repair, happy knowing where the fault is. But we're not reasonable people, are we? We want to know, how did that value get into that location in our memory? Why can we read it out? What happened between the Z80 and the ROM to put that there in the first place? There's my cat. I was actually about to start reading the contents of a Spectrum ROM when I realised I can use the machine itself to read the contents of the ROM just by using peek commands. Here's an interesting fact about the Z80. The first thing it does when it powers up is it goes to memory location 0 and reads an instruction from there. That will always be the first instruction within our ROM. So let's start drilling down. We can use this machine to read the contents of memory location 0 with print peak 0, and we get 243, which is a decimal value. 243 is hex F3, our binary 11110011. In CPU speak, F3 is our opcode, which is short for operation code. So what's happened here? The Z80 has set up the address bus with zeros, which I have painstakingly highlighted on this photo for your pleasure. As you might expect, these address pins go directly to the address pins on the ROM, so the ROM is receiving zeros on those pins. The Z80 sets some other bits which aren't so interesting, and the ROM responds by setting the data bus up with the binary value we can see in the top left there, corresponding to hex F3. Our CPU graciously receives the opcode, which is F3 in this case, but how does it know what to do with it? It's not by code or any software. The circuitry within our Z80 on the silicon is connected up in such a way that the correct response just happens thanks to good old physics. Fortunately, this is a good example. This is a 1 byte opcode. The instruction is simply to disable the interrupts, so the keyboard can't interrupt anything that's going to happen during the startup. Z80 instructions can be up to 4 bytes long, as we'll see shortly. Why is this relevant? Well, the ROM contains instructions to run a RAM test, so a little bit further down the line in the startup, a RAM test is going to be ran, which is going to find out the top of our usable RAM and dump it in that memory location which we read out earlier. You might recognise this screen with the red bars from other failed speckies, or if you're quick watching your specky start up, you might see them flash up for a moment while the memory test is being ran. I'm going to cheat a bit and use this book to find the address of the interesting instructions where the ROM tells the CPU to store the maximum usable memory address into the RAM. So skipping over the actual memory test, although I think that would be an interesting video, it would be a very long video, we find that at address 11F1 in hex, the ROM tells the CPU to store the RAM top, as it calls it, or the maximum usable memory address, into the RAM in that location where we can read it out for our diagnostic purposes. 11F1 is 4593 in decimal, so let's make a little program which is going to show us the contents of 4593 and the next 3 addresses. Because we know that instructions can be up to 4 bytes long, let's get as much information as we might need. Alright, 237, 67, 180 and 92. Let's have a look at what these mean to the Z80. I'm not going to draw 1s and 0s all over the pins of the Z80 this time, it's going to take forever. Let's just look at hex. Starting with 237, which is hexadecimal ED. As I mentioned earlier, the Z80 is wired up internally in such a way that whatever ED is meant to do will happen. Now, short of opening it up and reverse engineering it, not gonna happen, we're gonna have to look at an opcode table. Lucky us, these are fairly well documented on the internet, and I found this one which is really nice and easy to read. You can find ED down here, which actually directs me to another table. What this implies is that this instruction is longer than 1 byte. We need to go refer to the next table to figure out exactly what's going to happen. So let's look at the second byte of this instruction so we know where we're looking. Decimal 67 is hex 43. Here is the table which tells us what the second byte of our instruction means. Let's look at 43, and it says LD and then NN in brackets, comma, BC. And what does this mean? This means we're going to load, that's LD, the memory location specified by NN with the contents of the registers BC. Now, a register might not be obvious. A register is a memory location within the CPU. There are a bunch of these in there for various purposes and arithmetic and transferring bits here and there. Here they are on the die, they're actually in this location on the chip. Each register is 1 byte, so between B and C there are 2 bytes of data, and that is 16 bits, which is enough to represent a memory address. Now I can tell you from reading the ROM disassembly book that at this point in the proceedings, B and C contains the address of the top of RAM, which is the result of the memory test, which is the number we're interested in. The 2 ends in our opcode tell us that the Z80 needs to know 2 bytes of data, which gives it an address into which the contents of registers BC will be deposited. What a coincidence, my program's already read these 2 bytes, that's the 180 and the 92. Let's have a look at 180, that's hex code B4. Let's make a note of that. And finally 92 in our 4th byte of the instruction is hex 5C. This gives us our memory address NN 5CB4. The Z80 has all the information it needs now to execute this task. Oh, and by the way, what's 5CB4 in decimal? You guessed it, 23732, which if you remember is the first address in our instruction print peak blah 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 blah. Amazing, so hopefully now we understand on a real fundamental machine code level why that famous print peak command works. Just one last thing to clear up. Because we dropped 2 bytes of data into that memory location, it kind of overflowed into 23733. So between these 2 addresses we get data telling us the RAM top. Let's just take a second to complete the picture and understand where that 256 multiplication factor comes from. Let's call the bits in 23732 the lower 8 bits of our address that we're interested in, and 23733 then contains the upper 8 bits. Let's make things really clear and draw these out in 1s and 0s. I've just picked these numbers out of the air, they don't mean anything. When we stitch these 2 binary strings together, we're going to put the 23733 value over to the left as the upper 8 bits, like this, and this 8-bit shift to the left corresponds with a multiplication factor of 2 to the power 8 when we want to represent this number in decimal. And that pretty much explains it on a pretty fundamental level. Where does this command come from? Why does it work? Why is it so helpful to us? I hope that was interesting. I love all this digital computer electronic stuff and how CPUs work. I really like to understand how things work on a fundamental level. So coming back to our specky, our result was 32K. Now you might be thinking it's a coincidence that it landed exactly on 32K. If the ROM is searching for the top of the usable memory, it could fail anywhere, that number could be anything, so it seems like a strange coincidence. To explain this, let's start by making a little visual memory map of where all of the memory is in our machine. I've highlighted the Z80, the ROM, the lower and upper RAM. The ROM contains our first 16K of readable memory addresses, the next 16K is our lower RAM, and the final 32K is our upper RAM, or it would be if it was working. This shows us fairly clearly why a result of 32K implies that we have 16K of functional RAM. To understand why it always lands on exactly 32K or 64K, we need to zoom in a little bit on the upper memory here. You might notice that there are exactly 8 chips. That's not a coincidence. Each chip corresponds to 1 bit of data stored in each byte of memory. Let's highlight each chip with its corresponding bit, starting from bit 0 on IC15 all the way up to bit 7 in IC22. If we were to write the value FF, which is all 1s, to an address in upper memory, it would look something like this. The bits are shared across each of the chips equally. Each chip can only read out one bit of data at a time. So you can see why if you have one faulty upper memory chip, all of upper memory goes to pot. What this means for our print peak command is with any bad upper memory, you will always get 32K as the last usable address of memory. In fact, let's actually do this on our machine because it's going to help us identify or at least confirm which of our upper memory chips have gone bad. There's our command. We're going to poke FF or all ones, decimal 255 to an address in upper memory, and I'm simply going to read it straight back with a print peak command. Now what we should expect to see is 255, which is exactly what we wrote in, and that's not what we get. The result is actually 63, which corresponds to the binary we can see represented on the chips in this picture. Interesting, it looks like IC21 and IC22 are not playing by the rules. While we're at it, let's write in all zeros and see what comes back, because sometimes chips can fail in a way that means they only output 1 even when they should be outputting 0. I'll use the same upper memory location, 55555, write a 0, and I'm going to print peek it straight back and see what we get. Well, it looks like we're getting a 0 back, so our failure mode seems to be that those two chips, ICs 21 and 22, are stuck at 0, or at least aren't doing things like they should. What's really nice is these two chips are exactly the same two chips which the diagnostic cart told us to replace in the first place. Let's get those out. Lucky me, they're already in sockets, so I can just carefully lift them out and pop new ones in. And hey presto, it passes all of the upper RAM tests. Nice, we got a working Speccy. Okay, what about this faceplate? Let's do a little bit of hardware. Let's get the key mat off and remove this new membrane so we can deal with all of this glue. Depending on how the faceplate's been stuck down, this can be an easy job or a messy job or a nightmare. Luckily, this one's fairly easy. I'm just going to scrape the glue up and it's coming up nice and easy. It's quite satisfying actually to see it all shiny and new looking. Also did the same with the underside of the faceplate. Same deal, just scraping away at it until it was clean. What I'll do is put some new double-sided tape on and stick it down. Should be a big improvement. We still have to service this board now that we've repaired it. First thing I'm going to do is put a heatsink on the ULA, which means removing this socket. So let's get the iron hot and get that thing out of there. I'll give you the same advice I always give. Take your time, make sure every joint is free of solder as much as you can, wiggle the pins around until they're all moving free, and you want the thing to come out with very minimal force. Since this isn't my machine, I'm going to go around each of these joints and just check continuity from the joint to the trace which comes from it, just to make sure that I haven't damaged anything in removing the socket, and no, I did not damage anything. All that remains here is to solder the ULA directly to the board, keeping it nice and flush and flat, and then stick the heatsink to it. I tend to solder chips, especially ULAs, in with a bit of a crisscross pattern so I'm not just piling heat into one corner of the chip. Quick test that it boots up fine, and yes it does, although the screen's turned a little bit yellow. You might have seen this on issue 2, so you can get this problem with the tuning, and the way to address this is to fiddle with the variable resistor pots, which I'm doing here. If you're lucky enough to have an oscilloscope to hand, pop it onto the composite output from the board which feeds into the RF modulator, and twizzle those pots until the noise is minimal. You should get a good picture. Alright, heatsink is stuck down using double-sided thermal tape, so that should give the ULA hopefully a longer life than it would have had otherwise. I've also been over the edge connector, top and bottom, with a fiberglass pen. This gets it really shiny. I really recommend getting one of those. And of course we're going to change the capacitors. I like to do this with the board in a vise, cut the capacitor on one side and remove the capacitor body by hand, use some tweezers to remove the remaining leg, clear the joint and pop in the new capacitors. Great, everything's looking good. I'm going to do a quick check of the voltages because I've done a lot of work to the board with the ULA and the capacitors. This is just a quick check before doing the final job, which is a small mod to the power circuit which is recommended. It's done part of an issue 2 service I believe, and it involves a 4.7 microfarad capacitor. It's a bit of a fiddly one, but once you've done one or two it gets a little bit easier. You have to solder this capacitor between the leg of one of the blue capacitors on the board and a resistor. So I'm going to apply some solder to the leg of this capacitor and the leg of the resistor to the left. This should allow me to stick this new capacitor in place without too much trouble. There we go, that should do it. The only other part of this mod is to replace the top of the 3 resistors there on the left with one of a different value. You do need to bend it down out of the way so the case will close and it doesn't interfere with the keyboard membrane. Would be prudent to check the voltages once more. I'm going to do that now and everything's looking good before we put everything back together. Let's finish the job with this keyboard, the new membrane slotted back in. We'll get our rubber key mat on there and pop the faceplate on with some double-sided tape. This 3M stuff is really good, I recommend getting some if you can find it. I have used glue in the past to do this, I don't recommend it, it's messy, can cause discoloration to the plastic, and it's a complete nightmare to remove in future. Alright, amazing, what a journey it's been. Let's get this new keyboard hooked up, screw the case back together and play some games. I'm going to use the trusty Dandanator because it has a diagnostic ROM as well as a bunch of games loaded on there. Hey, Manic Miner, what a classic. The only thing to do to finish this job after playing loads of games on it for fun is to stick on the happy little diode seal of approval / anti-tamper sticker before shipping it back home to the owner, where it will hopefully be enjoyed for another good 30 to 40 years. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know we went a bit deep on the machine code, but I love doing that. I hope that you guys are like me and you like to understand things. If you made it this far, I assume you like what I'm doing, at least to some extent, or you fell asleep. Please consider heading over to the Patreon page linked below for little bits of extra behind the scenes content. Thank you so much for watching, please share with your friends, please like and please subscribe.